very happy to be here. So my name is Anna, and I started practicing macrobiotics about 12 years ago with Denny and Susan Waxman in Philadelphia, who you'll meet later in the panel. And then I worked for 2 years at the Kushi Institute in Beckett, Massachusetts as a head chef. And I also did my levels 1 through 3 there. Since then, I've continued my studies with Michael Rossoff and Warren Kramer. And I currently live in Virginia in the US. And I work as a private chef for private clients. And at the onset of COVID, I also started a website and a blog and some online cooking classes. So if you enjoy the class today, you can hop over to the blog and learn more about me there. So I think I'll get started. Yeah, we just have this big view, but I think it's fine. So before I get more into the class, I am going to actually start the kale dish because it's probably going to take the entire duration of the class. And so I'm going to be making a light grated carrot salad and a tahini sauteed kale. And I have the recipes, I sent them to Janat, so you'll be getting those as well. So here I've already browned the garlic in advance because it just kind of takes a while if you do it over a low flame. So I did do that in advance, but I'm going to show you all the subsequent steps. So, you know, you may be thinking, wow, this is a kale dish and it's going to take the entire duration of the class. Like, that's kind of unusual. Usually in macrobiotics, we cook kale with a quick cooking style, so quick steam or quick blanch. And I'll get more into the energetics of this and why I'm doing it this way today a bit later. But first, I have this brown garlic here with the olive oil, and I'm going to add a little bit of za'atar. Oh, you can't see that view. So this is za'atar, and this is a Middle Eastern herb mixture made of dried wild thyme, sumac, and sesame seeds. And if you can't find this, you could also use maybe about a teaspoon of just dried thyme. But I really enjoy this mixture, and my mom's family is from Lebanon, so she gave this to me. Actually, she went to Beirut about a year ago and brought some back for me, so I was very excited. So I have this on a very low flame, and I might need to turn it up slightly. These portable burners are a little bit finicky, but I figured you could see better than if I use the range that's behind me. So all I'm doing here is I'm just looking for the thyme or the za'atar to be slightly fragrant. It takes about 30 seconds. So I'm not trying to cook it a lot, but in the culinary world, we call this blooming. And that's what you do with herbs and spices that are dried to kind of like refresh them and let them really unfold their full flavor potential. So the za'atar is where I want it to be. And now I'm going to add my kale stems that I have here already cut, and I'll show you a bit later on how to cut those. So I'm going to add those in, and I can hear a slight sizzle, which is good. The oil is actually getting a little bit hot for me, so I'm going to turn this down slightly. When you're working with olive oil, because it's not a high heat oil, meaning it doesn't have a high smoke point, the smoke point is the temperature at which an oil becomes carcinogenic. So we want to avoid that. And when you're working with olive or sesame oil in like a saute, you really want to be sure you keep the heat really low so you don't reach that smoke point. And I would not use olive oil for any high heat cooking. If you were roasting vegetables, you know, it would be getting too hot. So with the kale stems, I'm really just sauteing them until they're fully coated with oil. And then I'm going to add about a 1/4 cup of water, and I'm going to put the lid on, and we're going to let that steam for about 10 minutes before adding the kale leaves. And the reason I'm cooking the stems and the leaves separately is because the stems are a lot hardier, more sturdy. And we could even say, in terms of how the vegetable grows, that the stems are kind of like the spine of the vegetable. So they're the most mineral-rich part of the vegetable, and they're what, you know, keeps it erect. And, you know, some people say, oh, perhaps if we eat the stem, it's good for our spine as well. So I'm going to add the water now, and we're going to steam that for about 10 minutes. I'm actually going to move this little burner over to the side slightly so I can show you how to cut the kale. And I'll be moving it back over in just a moment. Let me move this here. There we go. So I know that this is curly kale. You could also do this dish with lacinato kale, dinosaur kale. That's going to be, it's going to reduce a lot more when you cook it. So, you know, that's up to you if you want to make it that way. It's also fine. So I'm going to take the leaves off the stem. And I know a lot of people, they take the kale and they like to just rip it. And if I have the time and the inclination, I prefer to actually cut it off the stem. It's a little bit more gentle. And especially if you're prepping greens ahead of time, you know, if you're on the weekend for the work week ahead, you're trying to, you know, get a lot of greens washed and cut, so all you have to do is cook them, then actually cutting the stem in this way will rupture less of the cell of the vegetable, so it will keep a lot longer. So that's kind of like a neat little trick. So cutting it off here. And now, you know, this is going to be cooked for a long time. So we are going to cook this kale for probably about 20 minutes. And so it's fine to leave the pieces quite large because they'll reduce. So I'm just ripping them, you know, as I see the leaves curling right at those veins, that's where I'm ripping it. And now in macrobiotics, kale is classified as an upward growing leafy green vegetable, but botanically speaking, it's actually part of the cabbage family, which in macrobiotics we would say is more of a ground vegetable. And I'll get more into these different vegetable types in just a moment. But my point with this is kale is one of the green vegetables that actually can withstand quite a bit of cooking. And these burners are a little finicky, as I mentioned.
Let me ask you a few questions. Someone is asking if you were going to roast, what oil you would use. And another person is wondering if you might be able to move your camera closer so we could see more close up what it is you're doing.
Yeah, that's why I was hoping to get the other view. I can't really move it. So let's see.
I don't know what happened to it.
Do you see the view, the second view?
No, that's it. I only
on your
see
screen?
your name once. Hold on.
Italy, this kind of kale dish is quite popular, and often they'll add like white beans in it to make it just a little bit more rich and substantial. If you like Ethiopian cuisine, you'll find a very long cooked collard green dish that they sometimes make with kale as well. So it's quite common across the world. Also India, you know, they'll long cook like spinach, for instance, like spinach paneer or something. So I just wanted to show this like a different way of working with kale. Now for the stem, I know that, you know, often we'll just kind of like cut the stem across like so, but that actually doesn't open up enough of the cell structure of the stem. So what I like to do is I like to take off the tip here like so. And now this is a very thick stem, but I like to actually cut this in half. And you can see that the inside of the stem is going to be a lot more tender than this outer edge here. I also take off this little bit at the bottom because that can be a bit dry. And if you're wondering, I have a little bin at the bottom here, so I'm just dropping my vegetable scraps in there. And so for the stem, then I would just cut it across like at a, what is that, maybe 1/4 inch diagonal, like so. And you can see I'm keeping the tip of my knife on the board as I'm cutting. That is a French technique for cutting that I prefer that to the Japanese technique, which would be more like so. So lifting the knife in between each cut that you make. So as you can see, if we cut the kale that way, we're opening up a lot more of this stem structure here. Now, actually this stem, I'm looking at it, this is going to be quite dry. I hope you can see that. It has a little bit of these white parts, and we'll still use it today, but it means that the kale is a little bit old. And also sometimes if you cut the end off, like I just did before, what you'll often see is just like a white circle in the middle there, in which case I wouldn't use the stem at all because it's going to be very, very dry, and it won't soften up in the cooking process. So that's the stem. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the premise of this class, which was, you know, and for that purpose, I do have to introduce the concept of yin and yang. I know you've probably heard a lot about that today, But just to reiterate, and for the purpose of clarity, I'm defining those in the macrobiotic sense today, so not in the traditional Chinese medicine perspective, which yin and yang is a little bit different there. But to go over that and discuss that, which is in and of itself a very fascinating subject that would kind of go beyond the scope of the class. So I'm just going to stick with the macrobiotic perspective. And yin and yang are concepts that come from Taoism, or rather a concept. And basically, they're two antagonistic and yet complementary forces that are thought to be constantly creating and uncreating the universe. So yin is an upward and outward energy, and yang is an inward and downward energy. And so if you need an image with that, today in the class, we're using kale and we're using carrots. So carrots grow below the earth's surface. They grow down and in. So in macrobiotics, we would say that's more of a yang vegetable. Kale grows above the earth's surface, upward and outward. So that would be more of a yin vegetable. So anytime I'm saying yin and yang and you get confused, you can pull up that image of the carrot and the kale. And now actually I am going to add the leaves. This is looking pretty good. And it smells delightful. Kind of wish you were here and could partake in this experience. So much of cooking is, not just the presentation, but actually the smells. So here I'm going to add some more water, about half a cup. And this is just a little bit of the kale, and I'm going to add all of it. So this was about 4 large leaves of kale total. That was 1, and I'm going to add more. And you'll see it'll really, I'll barely be able to fit the top on this kale. But that's fine because it will reduce down. And so, this cooking style, which is sauteing and simmering, or in macrobiotics, you would say, actually Japanese cuisine, you would say kimpira. This is going to compress the kale, right? So it's going to reduce quite a bit. So let's try and fit all of that in there. And we don't have to worry too much about, what's on the bottom, what's on the top, if it's going to cook evenly, because we're cooking this for quite a long time. So I'm just going to pop the lid on here. There we go. Bring that to a boil again. And I'm actually going to move this to the range behind me to simmer because it's going to be going for 20 minutes. And, we don't have to babysit it too much while it's doing its thing. So in macrobiotics, we have these 3 different vegetable categories, we would say, that we look at through this lens of yin and yang. So as I mentioned, root vegetables, including carrots, grow below the ground, and they are thought to nourish more the lower parts of the body. So the legs, the reproductive organs, the intestines. Then we have ground vegetables that grow closer to the earth's surface. So you could say cabbage or cauliflower or turnip. And those are thought to nourish more the middle organs. So spleen, stomach, pancreas. And then we have our upward growing leafy vegetables. So like kale or bok choy or napa cabbage. And those are thought to nourish more the upper parts of the body. So the lungs and the brain. And now I'm going to move this over back here, and we're just going to simmer this on a low flame, so not too high, and I will check it from time to time, and I'll be sure to move it over at the end again, just to make sure that you can see the finished product. We're actually going to be mixing this with a tahini sauce, so I'll show you that. So that's the yin and yang of vegetables in a nutshell, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that, and of course you could argue, well, kale is a fairly young, upward growing leafy vegetable. So you'll see yin and yang is a comparison game, and nothing is in and of itself yin or yang. So we could say, okay, if we compare the carrot and the kale, the carrot is more yang. But if we compare kale to bok choy or napa cabbage, for instance, let me just set the timer. Echo, set timer for kale for 20 minutes. Then the kale starts looking quite young, right? So it's always a comparison game. And of course, I'm choosing a quite young leafy green vegetable because if we did this dish with like bok choy, it would just kind of turn into a mush and it would be very unappetizing. So kale is very sturdy. It's actually a cold weather green. So the growing season is November to February, and carrots growing season is June to November. So diametrically opposite growing seasons. And so it actually does well in cold weather, and it gets a little bit sweeter with the frost. So, it's quite sturdy and it can withstand these long cooking times. So now we can also look at the yin and yang of cooking styles. So just to name a few off the bat, maybe you are familiar with like boiling, steaming, sauteing, soup making, deep frying. And each of those cooking styles can either be pulled into a yin direction or a yang direction, depending on the amount of time that we do them for. So let's take boiling for an example. We can do a quick boil called a blanch in the culinary world. So, putting something in hot water for maybe a minute, right? 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Or we can do a long boil, so boiling something for a long period of time. We can do quick saute, quick steam, long steam, etc. So as you can see today, we're using a yin vegetable, relatively speaking, with a yang cooking style, and we're going to be using a yang vegetable with a yin cooking style. So, we're reversing the status quo, because in macrobiotics, there's a tendency to take root and ground vegetables and prepare them with a yang cooking style, right? We might roast them in the oven or make like a nishime with them, which is a type of long boil, or make kinpira, which is the technique that we're using today, but with like matchstick carrots. And we tend to cook the leafy green vegetables with light cooking styles, right? Like we might quickly steam the kale, or we might blanch it, do a quick saute. So I thought it would be interesting to show you just different ways of working with the vegetables, so you can really see the intersection of the cooking styles with the vegetables, and to like expand the mind also, right? It's nice to try new things.
Anna, how about the use of fire? How strong was your fire when you were adding the kale?
So I added the kale and then I actually brought it to a boil again, because, if I had just added it on the thing is, it was quite hot, right, when I had the stems in there. But anytime you add an ingredient, it's going to lower the temperature. So often you'll have to adjust the temperature if you're adding something new. So I actually brought it to a boil again, and now it's simmering on a low heat, if that helps. Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, as I mentioned, now I'm going to move on a little bit to the carrot salad. And I already pre-grated all these carrots here. And now you can see, if we look at a carrot, let me just grab it over here. This is a fairly compact structure. What did I do by grading it? I actually expanded the structure, right? I made it more yin. So I peeled the carrots. You don't have to do that, but I often find, and when I'm by myself, I often won't, but if I'm making this for someone or for company, the thing is, if you don't peel it, often carrots are a little bit old if you get them at the grocery store, unless you grow them yourself maybe, and they can get a little bit brown. So you don't want to eat, the brown salad is not very pretty. So I do peel them. And so by grading, I'm opening the structure and I'm keeping the carrots raw, right? So more yin. And you could do this recipe with also like grated beets, or you can do grated daikon. So for variety, you can change this up. And that was kind of my goal with this class too. I wanted to show you a base recipe that you can then adapt to the vegetables that you enjoy, or what you have around. So the carrot salad is very simple actually. So we just have the grated carrot, and the key is really the dressing. So we're doing a lemon shallot dressing. And here I already have some shallots, minced shallots that I soaked in a little bit of lemon juice and ume vinegar. And that's not completely necessary, but it does take away a little bit of the pungency of this, the shallot. And that's a principle coming from Japanese cuisine that macrobiotics has really adapted. And I'm just going to take a quick look at my kale while I'm explaining. We're trying to pleasantly stimulate the palate without overwhelming it, right? So we want to take away a little bit of that pungency of the shallot so it's not overwhelming. And the key to doing that is just putting it with a little bit of lemon juice. You could do even salt if you don't have ume vinegar, and mix that. Now, I actually did this last night, but you could certainly do this, do this, and then while it's sitting, grate your carrot. And by the time you're done with your carrots, this will be ready to go. So to this dressing, and an interesting point actually is, so we looked at, kale versus carrot, yin and yang, right? And we can also look at the flavor in those terms. So the carrot is more sweet, that's more yin flavor. And the kale, its predominant flavor is bitterness or pungency. And as I mentioned, through cooking it or through, if it's exposed to the frost, it gets more sweet, but predominantly bitter. And so that's a yang flavor. So again, we have yin and yang, right? And now here we're using shallot, raw shallot. And in the kale dish, we're using browned garlic. So for our pungency agent, again, we can look at that in terms of yin and yang. The raw shallot is more yin than the browned garlic, right? So here I have the rest of the dressing ingredients in this little mason jar. It's just olive oil and mustard. And I'm just gonna shake this really well to emulsify it. So emulsify just means to make to stick together because oil and vinegar, they naturally repel themselves. So when you're making a dressing, you really wanna make sure it's emulsified well. Sometimes you'll get a salad and you'll kind of see like oil coating one part of the leaf and then some vinegar here, and that means the dressing wasn't emulsified well, and doesn't make for a very pleasant, chefs would say, mouthfeel. So I'm going to add this in with the shallot, and we're going to give that another shake. And if you were doing this salad with grated daikon, I would use light sesame oil instead of the olive oil, because olive oil does have, there are many different kinds, but tends to be a little bit bitter. And the carrot, because it's sweet, and also the beet, because it's sweet, they can kind of carry that bitterness a little bit better. You won't really taste it, so to speak. But the daikon is predominantly pungent. And so the olive oil and the bitterness of the olive oil and the pungency of the daikon don't make for a very harmonious balance. So I would substitute. So we're going to give this another shake. Also, another difference between our dishes is raw oil in the salad, cooked oil in the kale. So raw oil is thought to be more yin and to moisten more the peripheral parts of the body, so like the skin. Whereas if we cook oil, it tends to go deeper in the body and moisten more deeper parts of our bodies, for instance, the intestines, right? So that's another yin and yang difference between our dishes. So I'm going to mix this dressing in here.
What is the ratio of the olive oil to the mustard?
I think I did 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And you know what, I can actually, let me share the recipes in the chat quickly. I can pull up the document and put them right in there, and then you can follow along. Here we go.
And also when you send them to me, I'll be sending them out.
Yeah, I did send them to
you. Oh, you did,
so,
that's right, you did send them. So I'll be posting them.
Here we go. So you can open those and follow along. But they have, so it's 2 tablespoons of olive oil, I believe. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so you can check, but I think it's a tablespoon of lemon juice, 2 teaspoons of mustard, half a teaspoon of ume vinegar. I think that's what I did. And so this is a really nice dressing, even if you for a salad or, it's just very light and refreshing. Actually, before I finish mixing this, you can see I'm a little paranoid about my kale, but kale, and here I can already see, I'll show you this quickly to pull it off, but I can hear that, you can't really see it, but the water is not there anymore. So I have to add a little bit more. Now, kale is a very thirsty green, and it does require quite a bit of water. So just if you're making this at home, just be sure to check the water level periodically and just add a touch more as needed.
Anna, a substitute for the ume vinegar would be what?
Sea salt, yeah. And so people often say, oh, don't use sea salt, without cooking it. But if you mix the sea salt with the lemon juice, because it's acidic, will actually cook the sea salt. So you can actually observe that if you just put a little bit of, do an experiment, put some lemon juice in a bowl and put some sea salt in it. And after about 10 minutes, you won't really be able to see it anymore, right? It'll be dissolved in the lemon juice. So, that's why in non-macrobiotic circles, if you're cooking, people will so often use salt in a dressing, but you can really mitigate that effect of the raw salt by just soaking it in the acidic medium, so vinegar or lemon juice or whatever you're using. If you were substituting, you probably need a little bit less than the ume vinegar. So I think I said half a teaspoon of ume vinegar, I believe. So you might just want to do like 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt, something like that. That's probably what I would do, and go with that. But yeah, absolutely, salt is, you can certainly use that. You don't need the ume vinegar. And interestingly, ume vinegar is actually not a vinegar. It's the pickling brine of umeboshi plums. So, you know, that's a whole nother story. Okay, so we have our dressing. And, you know, you could leave the salad as is and just eat it like this, very light, very refreshing. But my observation has been that people often like a little bit of extra, you know, in their salad. So I'm adding some dried barberries and toasted walnuts. And if you've never heard of barberries, here's a little bit to show you. They're often used in Middle Eastern cooking. So there's, for instance, a Persian rice dish called jeweled rice, and these are the little jewels in the rice. So they're kind of akin to a cranberry. And you know, if you can't find these or don't want to use them, you could certainly use like you know, currants or raisins or dried cranberries instead. So they're not, you know, they're not necessary, but they have a very nice tartness. So again, very refreshing. So I'm just going to add the rest of these ingredients here. And I'm going to add a little bit of cilantro. So this is cilantro that I chopped earlier today. And I did want to show you briefly, I'm just going to kind of eyeball this, but in your recipe, I do think I indicated, I believe it was about 2 tablespoons, but you know, this is like, if you really like cilantro, you add more. And I know there are some people who don't like cilantro at all. It's actually a genetic thing. So to certain people, it tastes like soap. And if you're one of those, you could definitely substitute parsley. I happen to love cilantro, and it also has the ability to remove heavy metals from the body. So I try to eat cilantro pretty much every day. So here I'm going to mix this a little bit. And basically, that's another interesting difference between our dishes, right? Cilantro is a fresh herb, and za'atar is a dried herb mixture. So again, fresh, more yin, dried, more yang. So again, we have yin and yang playing on that level as well. So this is our grated carrot salad, and I'm going to put this in a little serving dish so you can see. I also prepared for you, just so you could see, yesterday I made grated beet salad. Yeah, so this is the same recipe, just using beets. In which case I probably wouldn't use the barberries because, you know, there's going to be no color contrast, red and red. So in which case you could use the currants, for instance, would be very nice. Just be careful, whatever dried fruit you're using, to cut it to, you know, the size of maybe like a currant. So if you have a raisin, I would cut those in half. Cranberries, I would cut them in half. And that may seem, you know, overly neurotic, but in this salad, so with a salad, usually you want the ingredients to harmonize together. And that's why we try to cut things about the same size. So if you have like these really big cranberries or something in your salad, and you have these very finely grated carrots, it just, it's gonna stand out too much, right? So that's the consideration there. And this is the daikon, grated daikon. So you could definitely do this dish with either of those as well. And an interesting thing I wanted to say about carrots is, you know, here in the West, we often just think carrots are orange, but cultivated carrots nowadays can actually be separated into 2 groups. So we have the purple carrot that's home to Eastern Asia. And then we have the orange carrot that is cultivated in the Mediterranean, primarily, Europe and the Mediterranean. And the orange carrot wasn't always orange. So it's actually a hybrid of white and red and wild carrots, and it was cultivated for the first time in Holland in the 17th century. So it's kind of a new thing, actually. And the reason that it's orange is it has oil-soluble pigments called carotenes, so carotenes, and those give it that orange color. And then the purple carrot actually has a water-soluble pigment called anthocyanins. And that's, you know, those are present in foods with like purple or black or blue color, you know, like purple cabbage. And, you know, that's not really that important, except when you're cooking. If you're making a water-based dish, like let's say you're making a soup, I would not use the purple carrot unless you want your entire broth to turn purple. Because the pigment is water soluble, you know, the color will leach out into the water, whereas the orange carrot will retain, you know, its color more, so perhaps more appropriate for like a stew or a soup. So that's kind of an interesting, let me see my notes here. Yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to say about the acidic medium that we're using in both of these dishes. So you can see we're using lemon juice, and then later on in the kale, we're going to make, and I actually can show you right now, we have a miso tahini sauce. So I already made that, but this is white miso with tahini and umeboshi vinegar. And, you know, what I mean by acidic agent is the sourness, right? It's not acidifying in the body, but it's a sour flavor. And in French cooking, we have the holy trinity of flavors, right? We have fat, we have salt, and then we have the acidity. And what I often observe is that people who, are just starting out with cooking or perhaps don't cook that much, they're very good at including the fat and the salt, but that acidity is often missing. And that's actually a very important factor in desserts as well. You always want to have some acidic medium in desserts. So it could be apple cider vinegar or lemon juice. But again, we can look at yin and yang. So in the carrot salad, we have the acidity from lemon juice, right? From a raw fruit, raw citrus fruit. And miso is a paste that is made out of cooked grains and beans that is fermented with a mold spore called koji. So it's, from a cooked grain or bean, very different from fruit, right? So again, yin and yang happening on that level as well. Now let's take another look at our kale. And this is a very thirsty bunch. It's hard for me to give exact measurements with these things because so much is dependent on the vegetable you get. So for instance, this kale is extremely dry. And that, I also prepared it yesterday, so that makes it a little bit even more dry. But, if you had a really tender kale, you might not need to add as much water. You might not even need to cook it so long for it to reduce, right? It would, so it's all dependent. Or the carrot, if it was very dry, you might want to add more dressing. If you had a very juicy carrot, you might want to add less dressing. So, these are all, the recipes are guidelines, but you really have to be present with your food and kind of intuitive, right? You need to know what does the ingredient need. So, and usually if you're quiet and you're present, that'll come to you naturally. It's not difficult. We're kind of pre-programmed to do that as humans, I think. Also, what I did want to say about the carrot salad, because I thought people might have this question. So I did grate it on a box grater. And you could do it, I did it on the large grater setting. If you did it on the smaller grater setting like so here, large and small, right? It's going to be a lot moister because we're opening up more of the surface area of the vegetable. So I tend not to do that so much because it can get a little bit mushy, especially if this is a dish that can keep really well in the fridge for 4 days. And so I probably wouldn't do it on the smaller grater setting. Another interesting point about grating is, for those of you who are familiar with like a ceramic grater, if you want to do like grated daikon, if you're doing tempura or just want to have some on the side, that's a different style of grating that is actually more yang if compared to this box grating, because what it does is it compresses the vegetable and makes it smaller, as opposed to this style of grating, which opens up the vegetable and makes it larger, right? And the grating, because we're exposing more of the surface area of the vegetable, will actually make it a lot sweeter. So if I just bite into this carrot raw, it's going to be a lot less sweet than, after grating it. So again, yin and yang happening there as well. Now let's take a look at it. Let's see how much time. Echo, how much time is left on timer? I have a feeling the kale is, 30 seconds. Wow, that was pretty accurate. Okay, so let's take a look at our kale here. I'm going to move it back over. And now there's a little bit of water on the bottom still. And you can see when I'm taking the lid off, I'm not just taking it off and like going over here because, this has been steaming. So there's a lot of liquid on this lid here. And I like to like put that back into the dish. So let's take a quick look at this. Yeah, there's hardly any water left. Echo, cancel timer.
The kale timer is done.
Yeah, this is good. Echo, cancel timer. Echo's a little bit rambunctious. Echo is my kitchen assistant because I'm notoriously bad at timing things. So I kind of just tend to go with my intuition. So Echo keeps me on track. So as you can see, can't see so well, but this has been greatly reduced, right? So we started off where I could barely put the lid on, and now it's reduced to at least half the size. And now you could keep cooking this, you know? I mean, you could go for an hour even, you know? I mean, it would get very tender. But the nice thing is it won't really get mushy. So it's, you know, you don't have to worry about that too much. So to make this a little bit more interesting, I'm going to be mixing this with the tahini sauce, and then I'm actually going to cook it a little bit longer so that the tahini will curdle. So we're going to mix that in here. And I did mix the tahini in this is a suribachi, and it's a Japanese style mortar and pestle, which on the side, it has like these little groves, which is really nice for dissolving miso or, you know, if you're grinding sesame seeds, because a traditional mortar and pestle doesn't have these groves on the inside,
Grooves,
right?
not
So,
groves, grooves.
oh, grooves. You have to, yeah. English is not my native language, so I'm always, sometimes I make mistakes. So thank you. I'm Swiss. I'm half Swiss, so I grew up in
Okay,
Switzerland, and
all right.
actually that's interesting because speaking about Switzerland, there's much more, you know, seasonality in Switzerland. So kale is a vegetable you can only find in the wintertime. And, you know, inversely, bok choy you would not find in the wintertime. And then in the summer, that's when you have your leafy salads and, you know, more your Napa cabbage, but very seasonal. And, you know, where I am in the US, it's, unless you go to a farmer's market, it's really not like that. And so, you know, often people will be like, oh yeah, I eat kale all the time. And, you know, I mean, I love kale, but it's just interesting, you know, that things are available all the time here. So mixing this with the tahini sauce. And so this is, you know, this is a nice dish to make if you're feeling like you want something that's more warming and nourishing, but not quite as heavy as like a root vegetable long cooked dish. You can imagine, you know, if we did this dish with carrots, because of the starch of the carrot, it would be a lot heavier, right? So here we go. And now we're going to let that cook about 10 minutes more. So I'm going to actually turn on this burner. And, you know, you could serve it as is, but I do like the tahini to curdle slightly. So, and you'll see what that looks like in a moment. Now, if you were using lacinato kale, instead it would reduce down a lot more. So it would be about, you would have about half the amount of kale here, you know, starting with the same amount. And in that case, I probably wouldn't add the full amount of tahini sauce because it'll be too saucy, right? So I would probably do, yeah, like half the amount of sauce. So let's cover that and let that cook for about 10 minutes longer. Let me look at the time. So we're almost at our time. So let me just turn that down slightly. You know, we can do the Q&A and then take a look at the finished dish at the very end, if that's okay. And let me just see, look at my notes here. I had a lot of notes. I don't know if I got to everything.
Well, let
I
me
did want
ask
to
you
say,
about
you know, yes.
I'll just ask about the carrots. If you didn't want to use carrot or beet, could you use squash or something else?
You could try. I think the squash, it might be very dry, and you might not get it to be, you know, carrots are nice to use in this dish, or beets, because you actually can eat them raw, and they taste quite good. Squash raw is a little bit tough, you know, so, but you could certainly try.
Maybe kohlrabi.
Kohlrabi would be delicious. Absolutely, you could do this with kohlrabi. Yes, that would be really lovely. Trying to think of other, you could do, I mean, turnip is a strong flavor, but you could do it with turnip. So yeah. And the only other thing I wanted to say is, you know, I did choose to emphasize vegetables in this class because, macrobiotics, the diet is centered around grains and vegetables, and we could say, okay, the grain is more yang, the vegetables more yin. My observation has been that the grain is there in some form for most people, even if they're not practicing macrobiotics or a plant-based way of eating, even if it's white toast, right? The grain, in some form or another, it's there. What I think is really lacking in today's world is vegetables. I think people don't eat enough vegetables. And the most common question I get from clients is, how do I cook vegetables well? I want to eat more vegetables, but I don't want to steam, then they start steaming everything, right? They just do like steamed broccoli, steamed cauliflower, steamed carrot, and then they get really bored, and then they don't want to eat vegetables. And then, so I thought, oh, let's show different ways of preparing vegetables that most people are familiar with, right? Most people know kale, most people know carrot. So that was kind of the idea behind the class. And also, this, I was very intrigued by reversing the status quo of how we usually use vegetables in macrobiotics, and just to show you a different way. So yeah, I think that's it for me. And I know we have the Q&A, so we'll let this go. And at the very end, we'll take a look at that finished dish. So yeah, ask away.
Someone is asking, what is kohlrabi?
So it's a ground vegetable. It's how to describe it? It's like a round bulb, and it has these leafy greens that come out. You don't find it very often, at least here where I'm in the States, but in Switzerland, very common. And there it's actually it's prepared with like a cream sauce, so perhaps not so. But yeah, it's a ground vegetable. It has kind of a mild flavor, slightly sweet, I would say. Yeah.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah. Any other questions or comments or anything?
Wonderful class. Thank you so much. Great information, Anna. Thank you. Thanks.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes, yes. Well, I want to add my thanks to that because, Anna, it's just a beautiful class. I had some backs and forths with you about, carrots, what, and kale, what? And it's a beautiful class. You're a beautiful teacher, beautiful person. So it's really a pleasure. Yeah, I'm just really moved by you. You're so gentle, and yet you're very clear and direct with what you're saying. So it's a beautiful example for me of yin and yang. Yeah, really well done.
I'm so pleased. Yeah, it was funny. We had emailed, and we were trying to come up with a recipe for this class. And at first I actually said, oh, why don't we do baked greens? I was like, no.
I vetoed that one. now
because I was like, oh, we could do it. I was thinking in the Middle East, we have in Lebanon, we do spinach pies, right? So they're baked in the oven and like a crust and very, yang, obviously. But that would have been a little too much. So I thought, okay, let's do the saute. But yeah, I'm glad it worked out.
It did indeed. Yeah, it looks delicious. So yeah, let's see if I have one last question. Very proud about my daughter, Anna. This is from Barbara Leifer. Wish I could follow.
That's my stepmother, Barbara.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Hi, Barbara.
There. What are bearbells?
Barberries?
Maybe.
I'm assuming that's the question about the barberry. So there are these, here, I'll show them to you again.
Yes.
Here, they're these little dried red berries, and they're often used in Middle Eastern cooking. Let me put them in my hand so you can see them even better. So they're kind of like a cranberry. I mean, they're very tart. And so, a good substitute for these barberries would be cranberries. In which case I would probably have them, because as you can see, these barberries are very, very tiny. So, yeah, the theme in this class was a kind of a Middle Eastern theme, right? So we have the tahini and the za'atar and the barberries and the lemon juice and the olive oil. And, I love Middle Eastern cuisine, and it's one I turn to often. So that was, I guess, the commonality between these two dishes. We focused so much on the differences of yin and yang. But what they have in common is this thread of the Middle Eastern vibe, right? So,
Well, it's just been a real pleasure. I'm so
oh, thank
pleased.
you.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I'm
And so
really
I
grateful.
was so honored to be asked, and you know,
Oh, well.
it's
Huh.
really, yeah. So, and if you have, you know, questions that come up after, if you try the recipes, you can always email me. You
Okay.
know, if you have any questions, anyone, probably I should mention too, that with the salad, you know, I know it, I said it keeps well for like 4 days in the fridge, and that is true. Um, but I probably wouldn't mix in the nuts in that case if you're planning to keep it, you know, for a couple days, because what will happen is, again, yin and yang, right? Toasted nuts more yang. Um, and if they are exposed to that soggy, well, wet medium, you know, not soggy, but wet medium of the carrot dressed in this dressing, they'll get a little soggy. So to avoid that, I would just only mix the nuts into the portion that you're planning on eating right away. Yeah. So.
Very good.
How did you roast
Well,
your nuts?
Anna, thank you very much again.
Oh,
once
you're
again.
welcome. You're welcome.
And
And let me just show you the kale
okay.
quickly.
All right.
Very end
I'll
here.
include your email when I post the
Yeah.
next mailing with
Absolutely.
your recipes. Mhm.
Perfect, perfect. Here we go. So it's, as you can see, it reduced even a little bit further. So I do like to cook the tahini sauce into this for about 5 to 10 minutes, because as you see, it will curdle, right? So it looks like that. And so it, you know, it smells nice with the za'atar and the tahini, and it's, yeah, especially if you're having like a very simple grain dish, you know, just like brown rice or something. This is nice. It's a nice complement. It's a little more complex. It's a little more nourishing. So yeah. Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Okay, then. Great appreciation to you. Thank you so much. All your
Thank
time and
you.
effort.
Thank you.
Very
Thank
nice.
you.
Thank you.
Beautiful class. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much.
Ciao.